When I was in 8th grade, my school traveled to Washington, D.C. for an educational sightseeing tour of our nation's capital. Before we left, there was an essay contest. We had to write in 100 words or less why our nation's freedoms were so important and why we should preserve them. The winner of the contest would lay a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, that place in Arlington National Cemetery that commemorates American service members who have died without their remains being identified. I do not remember what I wrote in my essay, but I won the contest, and so I was to lay the wreath. As a 14-year-old, I certainly did not grasp the depths of the history of World War I or the depths of loss represented in the other tombs of the unknowns for World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I had no idea the significance of what I was doing at the time. It's one of those moments in life where I wish I could go back now and do it again, now that I'm older and I understand more. But I remember feeling like a fish out of water, surrounded by these men, and they were all men, in their uniforms. Like, who am I to be standing here with these guys, laying this wreath here? They felt so official and heroic to me. Like you could feel the sacrifice and selflessness oozing out of their silent, choreographed marching. These men had won wars, and I had just won an 8th grade essay contest. Looking back on it, it really was an honor and a privilege, and a great service that the military gives ordinary citizens like myself, to lay that wreath and to stand with a large crowd of living people behind you and an infinite number of graves before you with the inscription of all inscriptions just inches from your eyes. Here rests, in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God. It is not just so many of the dead that are known but to God. Our world is full of living people who are known but to God. Our own lives, yours and mine, are full of people known only but to God. But they could be known to us if we would see them, listen to them, acknowledge them. They're all around us, reflections of God's image, but we do not know them because they have yet to matter to our lives. Maybe one day they will, and we'll learn who they are. Or maybe they will never matter to our lives, or so we think, and so we will never acknowledge their existence alongside ours. But Scripture gives us a higher calling. In today's scriptural history lesson from 2 Kings, it is the unnamed and unknown people that are the agents of God's healing. God uses those who are cast as less than in their society and culture to be the voices of wisdom and rationality to one who is esteemed as greater than. Naaman was the one who was greater than. He was a commander of the army of the country of Aram, a bordering area north of Israel. Today it is known as Syria. Then, like today, the two countries were often at war with one another. And Naaman was a strong leader, recognized by his master as one with great skill. He was a great man, as the text says. But he, this valiant warrior, who in the Hebrew text says is literally lifted of face, also suffers from leprosy. The man whose face was lifted up with respect was now bowed down by shame because of this disease. The stigma of leprosy, of course, was strong. To have it was to be disgraced and outcast. And interestingly, the name Naaman in Hebrew literally means pleasant. And here was a man who was now facing being ugly. Well, the next person introduced into the story is the antithesis of Naaman. Naaman is described as a great man, but verse 2 introduces us to a young woman. He has a name, she does not. He was a great warrior, she was a captive. He lived a life that demanded respect. She was a servant. Yet despite being on foreign soil, and despite being a captive of war, she had the one thing that could rid Naaman of the condition that plagued him. She knew a guy, a healer guy. Though captive and stripped of her dignity by being a prized possession of war, given over to serve a foreign household, this maidservant is far from helpless and powerless. This otherwise unknown girl without a name gives her wisdom in the form of a command to the great commander that everyone knows by name. Her faith allows her to feel compassion for her oppressor. And not knowing whether he would listen to her or not, she offers what she does know to be true, that in her homeland there is a prophet who can heal. Well, with no other stones left unturned, Naaman goes to his king and tells him about this prophet that he's now heard about. And that king writes a letter to Israel's king. And the letter asks for Israel's king to deal with this situation, to handle it for him. And with the letter comes the anticipated payment for this leprosy reversement, if you will, this healing. Money, literally tens of thousands in today's currency, and clothing fit for a king. As one pastor put it, these two kings show that they are cut from the same cloth. One thinks that he can buy the miracle of healing, and the other, so engrossed in his own self-preservation, sees this letter as a pretense for war. Neither of them understand the dynamics that the simple servant girl understands, and that Naaman himself will soon understand. That healing comes through humility and faith, not hubris and finances or even fashion. You notice that Naaman's king did not actually send him directly to the prophet that could heal. He sent him to the other king first. Why did he do that? Well, we don't know, but it's probably because their societal structures were as unjustly bent toward people in power as ours are today, right? It was the right channel, the right way to do things. But the prophet Elisha hears about all of this, and he decides to short-circuit the system. He goes directly to the king himself, puts an end to that king's anxiety, and takes on Naaman and his situation. Like Naaman, Elisha has a name in this text. And like Naaman, Elisha is in a position of power, albeit his power, he knows, is from God, not from his own ego or efforts or military might. Even still, these men have names and roles that allow them to speak and be heard. But what's so powerful for those of us reading this story today is that the healing power of God is known not through these named men, but through unnamed servants. Because just as it was a servant girl who pointed Naaman to Elisha in the first place, it is another group of servants who talk sense into him when he doesn't want to do what Elisha says. You know, he travels to the house of Elisha with his entourage, and when Elisha simply sends a messenger out of his house and says, "Go wash yourself in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be healed," Naaman is not impressed. In fact, he's pretty upset. I mean, why doesn't the prophet come out himself and talk to him? Doesn't he deserve that? And why is he commanding him to wash in a filthy river to get rid of his own filthy body as he sees it? So he throws a little tantrum, and he does so in front of his servants, who I'm guessing might be rolling their eyes at him, but they say, "Are you kidding me? Just do what the man says. It's not even a hard task, it's easy." And so the unnamed servants carefully but confidently persuade their master to follow Elisha's command. And once again, Naaman is faced with a decision. Listen to these people who are lower than him in status, or write off their advice as their lower status would normally dictate him to do. Without an alternative, and I imagine because he had traveled that far, he heeds their wisdom. And the great Naaman goes not into one of the great rivers of his country, but into the muddy waters of the Jordan River. And he finds healing. But the true miracle is found in the simple decision of Naaman to heed the words of the prophet and to listen to the voice of God through those voices he had previously ignored. He paid attention to those outside his social circle, and guess what? It paid off. In the verses that follow, we see that Naaman understands what happened when he first saw his skin look like that of a young boy again. He knew that the God of Elisha was the God he must serve above any other king or god. His skin had been healed and cleansed, but more importantly, his vision was made more clear. His hearing was improved. In essence, his senses and his soul were cleansed from the inside out. Do you see how subversive this story is? The God of Israel, remember, the ones who claimed their God as an exclusive God for them, the God of Israel heals the king of an enemy land and uses servants to do it. This story fundamentally jars our common sensibilities about borders and boundaries, about who is in and who is out, who has power and who doesn't, who has a voice and who doesn't. It seems that the boundaries that we place around God's voice and power cannot and will not hold God back. Is it any wonder that in Luke 4, when Jesus preaches a sermon on this very text in the synagogue in Nazareth, remember the prophet in his own hometown, it makes those who are listening to him so mad, in fact, they want to hurl Jesus off of a cliff. They got what this story meant. No one likes to hear that their ways of being and doing in the world aren't God's ways. I mean, if something is done our way with people we know, we maintain power and control. And who doesn't want that? But if something is done in God's way with people we do not care to know, our power and control are threatened and maybe even diminished. The great warrior could not heal himself. The great king could not heal the great warrior. The little servant girl was the first healer. She held the knowledge of a prophet who could cure. And Elisha, a foreigner and person of a different faith, held the knowledge of what action to take, and a group of servants held the words that convinced Naaman to take that action. This all begs the question, what healing do we miss out on because we don't even see it or hear it, and therefore are never able to receive it? Who do we not know? Who do we need to know in order to know God better, to hear God's voice more clearly? Think about it. We are an incarnational people. That means that God works through people. God shows up in people, people like you and me. So when we look over anyone, we are overlooking a part of God. We cannot get to the healed and whole places God has prepared for us if we're only traveling with those who look and think and worship and dress and live and vote and love like we do. Naaman's healing comes together at the point where the fullness of the human experience meets, where the named and the unnamed discover that they share a common name, child of God. You know, the irony of my name being announced the day that I lay the wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, while the names of those honored at that tomb went unnamed and unknown, is not lost on me. Especially now that I myself am in the professional and pastoral business of naming and honoring those who have died. Coming out of divinity school and in my residency years, I was prepared, as much as any young minister can be, to sit with families in their grief, to plan and officiate internment and memorial services. It's a tender privilege that never gets old, even as your heart does get more seasoned with experience. What I was not prepared for, however, and still cannot seem to wrap my head or heart around, is the number of times in my ministry, in my life, that I would see breaking news flash across my TV or smartphone about mass shootings or terrorist attacks that leave hundreds of thousands of lives cut short, like those killed just this week in Bangladesh. These are real people with families and friends, real lives that had futures. But now we will never know, the world will never know, what God-given gifts they had yet to share with us. Potentially what healing they had to share with our broken world. Like the servants in today's story, there are so many people we do not know, whose names remain unknown to us, through whom God is speaking and working. And this is not just true for those who have died at the hand of violence or terrorism. This is true for those who are living in and among us, but might as well be dead to us because we don't see them. We don't listen to them or acknowledge them. And so we don't know how God is using them in the world. We don't hear how God is speaking to us through them. Now, we can't know everyone. I'm not suggesting that. But we can seek to know more people than we do today. We can seek to learn the name of one person who died in Bangladesh and read about their life, like Teresa Jane, age 19, who was a sophomore at the University of California in Berkeley. It is possible to learn the name of the one person who you might pass in the hallway at work. Maybe they take out your trash or work security during the night shift, and you have no reason to know their name until you might complain about the fact that your trash isn't being emptied on time. Confessional moment here. Or until you have to run back to the office after hours when the doors are locked and that security guard needs to let you in. But maybe we take the time to learn their name now, just because we want to know them for who they are and not how they can serve us. Is it possible to learn the name of someone who lives in your building, who eats alone or sits by the window in the common room? Is it possible to learn the name of your Starbucks barista or the homeless guy who works the corner by your house, or even the person that you see in these red pews here at Calvary who you've been meaning to get over and talk to but haven't yet? All of these names have lives behind them, and all of these lives are full of stories. And all of these stories are full of times that God has worked in their life or spoken a word of wisdom through their life. And when we don't get to know them, it's our loss. And we never know how much time we will have to get to know them. I'm sure we were all sad to see yesterday that Elie Wiesel died at age 87. Holocaust survivor and author, someone who fought for peace and human rights. He said once that if I survived, it must be for some reason. I must do something with my life because in my place, someone else could have been saved. And so I speak for that person. In commenting on that, I noticed a journalist this week that said throughout his life, Elie Wiesel sought to give a voice to the voiceless. I've never liked that phrase, give a voice to the voiceless. Because these people are not voiceless. They have a voice. We choose to ignore it or not listen to it or to speak over it or to mute it or in the horrific case of the Holocaust, to kill the body that houses it. We turn up the volume of our own voices and the voices of those like ours. And that's how we render people in society voiceless. But it's not because they don't have a voice. God's given them a voice. God gave Naaman's wife's maidservant and his servants voices, and they used them. And Naaman listened to them, and he was healed. Whose voices are we not listening to that we need to? This week, try to get to know one of them. You never know, their voice could be the voice of God that you've been straining to hear for so long. And yet, just like this maidservant in Naaman's life, who had been there all along, but he never noticed, these people in our lives have been there all along too. I don't know about you, but I want to have better vision, and I want to have clearer hearing, and I want to see as God sees and to hear as God hears. So I ask again, who do you not know? Whoever it is, they might just have something new from God to reveal to you and to our world. Amen.